White cops frame a black woman, unaware she's a CIA agent. The truth explodes in court. Late one night in a quiet Virginia town, two officers pulled over a black woman, accusing her of a crime she didn't commit. What should have been a routine stop quickly spiraled into something much darker, a carefully planned setup. But these officers had no idea who they were dealing with. Their target wasn't just any woman. She was someone with the power to dismantle everything they thought they controlled. What happens next will shake the entire police department to its core, exposing a web of lies, corruption, and abuse of power. And just when you think you know how this ends, the final twist changes everything. Stay tuned, because the truth is about to explode. The night was quiet in Arlington, Virginia. The soft hum of streetlights buzzed above empty sidewalks, and the occasional car sped down the deserted roads. Talia Porter sat behind the wheel of her sleek black SUV, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as she navigated the suburban neighborhood. She glanced at her watch, just past midnight. It had been a long day, but a small sense of accomplishment settled in her chest. Her undercover work in this quiet town was nearly complete, and she had everything she needed to make a clean exit. As she approached a deserted intersection, she slowed down, her sharp eyes catching the faint glint of a reflective stop sign. Talia had an instinct for details, a skill sharpened over years as a field operative. She came to a full stop, her hands steady on the wheel, then turned left onto the next street. Moments later, red and blue lights flashed behind her, their glow bouncing off her rearview mirror. The piercing wail of a siren shattered the stillness of the night. But Talia's heart didn't race. She was trained for moments like this. Instead, her mind sharpened, her breathing steady. She glanced in the mirror, watching the squad car close in, its headlights casting long shadows across her dashboard. With practiced calm, she guided her SUV to the side of the road, turned off the engine, and reached for her glove compartment to retrieve her license and registration. The patrol car stopped just behind her, lights still flashing. Two officers stepped out, their movements deliberate. The driver, a tall man with a square jaw and an authoritative stride, approached first. His partner, shorter and stockier, followed closely behind. Both wore the navy blue uniforms of the Arlington Police Department, their badges gleaming under the streetlights. Talia noted their names as they neared: Officer Brandon Carter and Officer Mark Sullivan. "Good evening, ma'am," Officer Carter said, his voice carrying a practiced authority. He leaned slightly, shining his flashlight into her window, the beams sweeping across her face and the interior. "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" Talia kept her expression neutral, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "No, officer," she replied evenly. "I wasn't speeding, and I came to a full stop at the intersection." Carter's lips twitched, a condescending smile forming at the corners. "Actually, you failed to stop at that sign back there," he said. "That's a moving violation." Talia's brow furrowed slightly, but she remained composed. "I'm certain I stopped, officer," she said, her tone calm but firm. "You must be mistaken." "License and registration," Carter interrupted, his tone hardening. Without hesitation, Talia handed over her documents, her movements slow and deliberate. She had no intention of escalating the situation unnecessarily. Carter examined her papers, his eyes lingering on her license. She felt his scrutiny, the subtle shift in his demeanor as he processed her identity. "Virginia plates, local address," he murmured, almost to himself, then spoke louder. "You live around here?" Talia nodded. "Yes, officer." Before Carter could respond, Sullivan, who had been lingering near the back of her vehicle, suddenly called out, "Hey Carter, you might want to take a look back here." Carter straightened, passing Talia's documents back without comment. "Stay in the car," he ordered before turning to join his partner at the trunk. Talia's jaw tightened as she watched them through the side mirror. Sullivan was pointing at something, his voice low and conspiratorial. Carter nodded, and the two officers exchanged a glance that sent a flicker of unease through her chest. It wasn't fear. Talia rarely felt that, but a sharp, instinctual warning. Moments later, Carter returned to her window, his expression now grim. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Talia tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but questioning. May I ask why, officer? We have reason to believe you're in possession of illegal substances, Carter replied, his tone clipped and almost rehearsed. Talia's eyes narrowed. Illegal substances? She repeated. I think you're mistaken. We'll see about that, Carter said, gesturing for her to exit. Sullivan was already waiting near the back of her SUV, a smug expression plastered across his face. Suppressing a sigh, Talia opened the door and stepped out, her movements unhurried, deliberate, like she had all the time in the world. She stood with her hands at her sides, watching as Sullivan theatrically lifted the trunk and gestured toward a small, unmarked bag sitting conspicuously near the edge. Well, what do you know? Sullivan said, feigning surprise. A bag of powdery goodness. Talia's gaze flicked from the bag to the officers, her face unreadable. Inside, her mind was working rapidly, cataloging every detail. That bag hadn't been there when she left her house. She was sure of it. This was a setup. Carter stepped closer, his smirk widening. Anything you want to tell us, ma'am? Talia's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, a subtle, calculated expression that conveyed neither fear nor guilt. I'll save my comments for the appropriate setting, she said smoothly. Carter chuckled, clearly interpreting her calm as arrogance. Oh, you'll have your chance. You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute. As Sullivan moved to cuff her, Talia allowed it, her gaze steady and unflinching. You're making a big mistake, she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet intensity. Sullivan hesitated for just half a second before snapping the cuffs into place. Yeah, we'll see, Carter said, leading her toward the squad car. Let's see how confident you are in front of a judge. As they drove away, Talia gazed out the window, her mind already spinning through her options. These officers might think they had an easy arrest, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. The ride to the station was silent, tense. The only sounds were the low hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Talia sat in the back seat, her hands cuffed behind her, her expression neutral. The fluorescent glow of passing streetlights cast fleeting shadows across her face, but her gaze stayed fixed on the road ahead. Inside, her mind was sharp, focused. She replayed every moment of the encounter like a puzzle coming together, piece by piece. The stop sign that didn't exist. The smug confidence of the officer. The planted bag. This wasn't just random corruption. It was calculated, rehearsed. These weren't mistakes. They were choices. Carter glanced at her through the rearview mirror, smirking. You don't seem too worried, he said, his voice laced with mockery, like he was daring her to react. Talia met his gaze in the mirror, unflinching. Should I be? Carter chuckled, shaking his head. You're either brave or stupid, lady. I've seen plenty of people act tough. Never lasts long in a holding cell. Talia didn't respond. She didn't need to. She knew men like Carter, men who bent the rules to their advantage, certain they'd never face consequences. For now, she let him believe he was in control. That illusion wouldn't last. The station was quiet when they arrived. Night shift officers lounged behind their desks, sipping coffee, chatting in low voices. Carter and Sullivan led Talia inside, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare on the scuffed linoleum floors and peeling walls. Got ourselves a big one tonight, Carter announced, loud and brash. The other officers glanced up, their curiosity piqued. Sullivan tossed the bag of powder onto the counter with a theatrical flourish. Caught her red-handed, he added. Looks like she's been running more than stop signs. Talia stayed silent, her eyes sweeping the room. She took in every detail. The placement of the cameras, the layout of the desks, the easy camaraderie among the officers. It was a small station, the kind where everyone knew each other, where secrets were kept and rules were bent. They led her to the fingerprinting station. Carter removed the cuffs and gestured for her to place her hands on the ink pad. She complied without a word, her movements calm and deliberate. The officer working the station, a younger man with tired eyes, hesitated as he looked at her, like he sensed something wasn't right. Name? He asked, his tone almost apologetic. Talia Porter, she replied evenly. Occupation? She paused briefly, choosing her words. Consultant. It was vague enough to pass, True enough to avoid a lie. The young officer nodded, typing her answer, though his unease was clear. Carter and Sullivan, however, were too busy enjoying the moment, laughing quietly as they leaned against the counter. Talia's voice cut through their amusement. "How long have you two been dirty?" Both men turned, their smugness flickering for half a second. "You've got a smart mouth," Carter said, his tone darkening. "Let's see how funny you are after a night in lockup." Talia's cell was cold, dimly lit. A metal bench bolted to the wall offered little comfort. The bars cast long shadows across the concrete floor, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. She sat with her back straight, posture unyielding. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing down the corridor. Carter lingered, watching her through the bars, a mix of curiosity and disdain in his expression. "You don't look like the type to get mixed up in this kind of thing," he said, almost conversationally. "But don't worry. The courts love a good sob story. Maybe they'll go easy on you." Talia tilted her head slightly, locking eyes with him. "Or maybe they'll see through yours." For the first time, Carter shifted uncomfortably. He muttered something under his breath and walked away, leaving her alone in the cell. Talia leaned back against the cold wall and exhaled slowly. She knew her next moves had to be precise. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was about to expose something much bigger. The only sound was the faint hum of the station's HVAC system. Talia waited, her patience forged from years in the field. Her absence would be noticed soon enough. And when it was, there would be questions. Her team would find her. They always did. For now, she played her part. The calm detainee, the unremarkable woman with nothing to hide. But every passing moment was another chance to observe, to gather intel. She noted the rhythm of the night shift officers' footsteps as they passed her cell, their routines and patterns. She listened for the quiet beeping of the station's computers, the crackle of the police radio. Every detail mattered. In the break room, Carter and Sullivan leaned back with steaming mugs of coffee, their laughter filling the space. "She thinks she's untouchable," Sullivan said, shaking his head. "Did you see her face? Not even a flicker of panic." "Yeah, well, that'll change," Carter replied with a smirk. "She's just another name in the system now. Nobody's gonna dig too deep." Sullivan nodded. "Besides, we've got everything we need. The evidence is airtight." Neither of them noticed the young officer from the processing desk lingering nearby, his face pale, his eyes darting toward the holding cells. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with him. But questioning senior officers here? That was dangerous. Back in her cell, Talia closed her eyes, her breathing steady. The hours ticked by, but she didn't sleep. She didn't need to. Every minute brought her closer to the moment when everything would come crashing down. The storm was coming, and Talia was its quiet eye. A pale sliver of dawn filtered through the narrow, high-placed window of her cell, casting a muted glow on the cold concrete walls. The waiting was almost over. A new day began. Talia hadn't moved much during the night, sitting upright on the metal bench, her eyes half closed in quiet meditation. Sleep was a luxury she rarely indulged in during missions. Her mind stayed sharper this way, constantly calculating, anticipating. Faint voices drifted from the hallway outside her cell. The station was waking up. Day shift officers began their routines, their footsteps distinct, their tones revealing more than they realized. A loud buzz signaled the unlocking of the cell block door, followed by the heavy thud of boots against concrete. Talia didn't flinch as Officer Sullivan appeared outside her cell, clipboard in hand, his usual smirk in place. "Morning, sunshine," he drawled, his voice thick with mock cheerfulness. "Sleep okay? Or was the cot not 5-star enough for you?" Talia met his gaze without a word. Her silence unsettled him more than he'd admit. He shifted slightly, glancing down at the clipboard. "You've got a bail hearing this afternoon," he said, tapping the paper with his pen. "But between you and me, I wouldn't get your hopes up. Judges around here don't take too kindly to drug traffickers." Talia tilted her head, her expression calm, unyielding. "Good to know," she said softly. For a brief second, Sullivan's smirk faltered. He cleared his throat and stepped back. "Enjoy your breakfast," he muttered before walking away. Talia leaned back against the cold wall, watching him disappear down the hallway. The cracks in their facade were starting to show. She just needed a little more time. At the front desk, Officer James Keller sat stiffly, eyes following Sullivan as he strode through the station. Something about this case didn't sit right. Keller had only been on the job for a few months, but he'd processed dozens of arrests. This one felt different. The suspect, Talia Porter, hadn't acted like anyone he'd seen before. She wasn't defiant. She wasn't scared. She was calm. Too calm. Every word she spoke was deliberate, measured. And then there was the bag of drugs, right there in the trunk, wrapped up like a gift. Keller hesitated, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. He knew how things worked here. You didn't question senior officers. But the doubt gnawed at him. His eyes flicked to the surveillance monitors mounted above his desk. The feed showed the hallway outside the holding cells. Talia sat on the bench, still as a statue, her expression unreadable. Keller bit his lip, a flicker of resolve sparking inside him. Meanwhile, Talia made her move. Her hands rested casually in her lap, but her sharp eyes were locked onto the security camera outside her cell. It was an older model, likely outdated. Cheap surveillance. The kind that came with a limited budget and even more limited oversight. She waited until the hallway was empty. Then, with a barely perceptible shift, she pressed her palm against the hem of her jacket. A silent click. A signal. A beacon that would reach her team within moments. No words were needed. They would know what to do. In the break room, Carter and Sullivan lounged with their morning coffee, laughing over the paper. She probably thinks she's gonna outsmart us, Carter said, shaking his head. They always do. Sullivan chuckled. Yeah, well, she's in for a rude awakening. This case is a slam dunk. We've got the drugs, the arrest report, no witnesses. Nobody's coming to save her. Carter leaned back, grinning. You know what I love about this job? The predictability. You see the same types over and over. They think they're smarter than us. He smirked. But they never are. Their laughter filled the room. Neither of them noticed Keller, lingering just outside the doorway. His hands were clenched at his sides. His gut told him something was wrong. A few miles away, in an unmarked office, a phone vibrated softly. A hand reached out, answered. A calm, authoritative voice spoke. Signal received. Location confirmed. Deploying resources. Back in her cell, Talia leaned her head against the wall and let her eyes close for a brief moment. She could almost hear it, the quiet precision of her team mobilizing in the background. Every second that passed brought her closer to the inevitable reckoning. A faint smile ghosted across her lips. Not a smile of joy. A smile of certainty. The officers had no idea what was coming. Across the station, the morning carried on. Reports filed, calls answered, coffee poured. Business as usual. For everyone except Talia. Because for her, the countdown had already begun. For Carter and Sullivan, today felt like a victory lap. Talia sat motionless in her holding cell, composed as ever. Through the bars, she glimpsed flashes of the station's routine. The occasional passing shadow, snippets of conversation, but she remained focused. She knew how to fade into the background when necessary, to become invisible until the precise moment when visibility mattered most. Her signal had been sent hours ago. She trusted her team implicitly, but they wouldn't act immediately. Timing was critical. In the meantime, she needed to plant the seed of doubt. At the front desk, Officer Keller's eyes flicked to the holding cell monitors again. Talia hadn't moved much since her arrival, but something about her gnawed at him. It wasn't fear. It wasn't defiance. It was patience. A quiet confidence that felt misplaced for someone accused of drug trafficking. Frowning, he pulled up her file. Her license and address were standard, but her employment history? A red flag. Her most recent job was listed as independent consultant, with no further details. Keller minimized the file and glanced toward the break room, where Carter and Sullivan were laughing over coffee and donuts. Their easy demeanor made his stomach churn. Against his better judgment, he clicked into the arrest report. Stopped for failure to yield at a marked intersection, he read under his breath. Driver exhibited nervous behavior during questioning. Consent to search granted. Controlled substances found in the trunk. It all looked by the book. Too by the book. Keller had been trained to recognize deception. And this? This felt scripted. As the hours passed, the unease inside him festered. His footsteps carried him toward the holding cells more often than he cared to admit. His eyes kept returning to Talia. Finally, he worked up the nerve to speak. "Miss Porter." She looked up, dark eyes sharp. "Assessing." "Yes?" Keller hesitated, his hand resting on his belt. "Did you really consent to the search of your car?" Talia tilted her head slightly. Studying him, she saw the doubt, the faint cracks forming in his resolve. "What do you think, Officer Keller?" she asked, her tone calm but pointed. Keller swallowed hard. I'm just doing my job." His voice faltered. Talia's gaze didn't waver. "That's what they're counting on." Men like Carter and Sullivan needed people like Keller to look the other way. Keller's face flushed. He stepped back, stammering something unintelligible before retreating down the hall. But Talia had seen it. The hesitation, the conflict. The seed had been planted. In the heart of Arlington, a sleek black sedan rolled to a stop outside a nondescript building. A man in a tailored suit stepped out, his movements deliberate. Two agents flanked him, their presence sharp, professional. "ETA on extraction?" one asked as they entered the building. The man checked his watch, his expression unreadable. "We proceed when she gives the signal. For now, we watch." Inside a secure operations room, multiple monitors flickered. One screen showed Talia, unmoving in her cell. Another displayed the front desk, where Keller was pacing. A third captured the break room, where Carter leaned back in his chair, sipping his third cup of coffee. "You see Keller earlier?" he asked Sullivan. Kid looked like he'd seen a ghost. Sullivan smirked. "Probably overthinking things. Fresh out of the academy, they always get jumpy on their first big case." "Yeah, well." Carter's tone darkened. "Let's hope he doesn't start asking too many questions." Sullivan shrugged. "Doesn't matter. The evidence is airtight. She's got no alibi. Even if he gets nosy, there's nothing he can prove." Carter nodded, but for the first time, a flicker of unease crossed his face. Keller's doubt is contagious, he realized. The tension in the station thickened as the day wore on. Talia could feel it, an almost imperceptible shift in the air. Her team was watching, waiting. The moment wasn't right yet, but soon, footsteps echoed down the hall again. Slower this time. "Keller." He stopped outside her cell, his expression conflicted. "You said they're counting on people like me," he murmured. "What did you mean by that?" Talia's gaze was steady. "You know exactly what I mean." The question wasn't whether he saw it. It was whether he was willing to act on it. Keller stared at her for a long moment before turning and walking away, shoulders tense. Back in the operations room, the suited man watched Keller's retreat on the monitor. A faint smile ghosted across his lips. "He's close," he murmured. One of the agents glanced at him. The man's smile widened. "Then we turn this whole thing upside down." Keller sat at his desk, fingers drumming against the edge as he stared at his monitor. Talia Porter's digital file remained open, but the words blurred as his mind churned. A knot had formed in his chest, a sensation that had been growing since the arrest. Something wasn't right, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. He glanced toward the break room, where Carter and Sullivan were still laughing, their easy camaraderie grating against his unease. The station felt heavier than usual, like the walls were pressing in, like the entire building was holding its breath, waiting for something no one saw coming. Keller's thoughts drifted back to the holding cell, to Talia's words. "That's what they're counting on." Her voice had been calm, deliberate, as if she knew exactly which buttons to press. And maybe she did, but was she wrong? As the hours dragged on, doubt hardened into quiet resolve. He needed answers, but he couldn't afford to draw attention to himself. His status as a rookie already made him an easy target for teasing. Any hint of insubordination would only isolate him further. So he waited. When Carter and Sullivan finally left the room, Keller slipped into the records archive. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across rows of filing cabinets and computer terminals. He logged into the system, hands trembling slightly as he searched past cases tied to Carter and Sullivan. Their names appeared again and again. Minor traffic violations escalating into drug charges. A pattern, and then another, and another. Most of the defendants were people of color. Most were convicted. The knot in Keller's chest tightened. In her cell, Talia remained still. A picture of composure. She had spent years training for moments like this, for when the waiting was long and the stakes were high. Through the bars, she watched Keller's shadow move past. His pacing had slowed. His steps were more deliberate. He was close. Close to breaking the cycle of blind loyalty that men like Carter and Sullivan relied on. She shifted slightly on the bench, just enough to catch his attention. He stopped, turned to face her. Officer Keller. His hand gripped the edge of the wall like a lifeline. "What?" he asked, his voice low, almost defensive. "You've seen something, haven't you?" Talia tilted her head. "Something that doesn't add up?" Keller swallowed hard. "I can't." He stopped, his voice catching. "I'm just trying to do my job." Talia's gaze was steady. "And what is your job, exactly?" she pressed. "To follow orders? To look the other way when you know something's wrong?" Keller's jaw tightened. His eyes darted down the hall. "You don't understand how things work around here," he muttered. Talia didn't blink. "I understand more than you think." Her voice was quiet but unyielding. "I know what it's like to feel trapped, to think you don't have a choice." She let the silence stretch before finishing, her words deliberate. "But you do, Keller. You always have a choice." Keller walked away, but her words followed him. Like a shadow. Back at his desk, Keller hovered over his keyboard. The list of cases tied to Carter and Sullivan glared back at him, each name making his stomach twist tighter. Finally, he made a decision. He opened a secure email channel. His fingers moved faster as his resolve solidified. He attached the case files he had found. Then he typed, "To whom it may concern, there's something wrong in this station. I don't know who else to turn to. Please help." His heart pounded as he hit send. The message vanished into the void. He didn't know who would receive it, or if they would even care. But it was the first step. The first step toward doing what he knew was right. In the break room, Carter leaned back in his chair, coffee cup balanced on his knee. "You notice Keller acting weird today?" he asked, glancing at Sullivan. Sullivan shrugged. "Kid's always weird. What's he gonna do? Rat us out?" Carter smirked, but his eyes narrowed. "Still, keep an eye on him." His voice darkened. "Last thing we need is some rookie poking his nose where it doesn't belong." That afternoon, a black sedan pulled into the station lot. Inside the car, Talia's team prepared for their next move. They had intercepted Keller's email, exactly as planned, and now they had everything they needed. "Let's make this clean," the team leader said, adjusting his tie. "No unnecessary disruptions. We exposed this from the inside." They stepped out. The sun caught their badges, flashing gold. FBI. Inside her cell, Talia smiled faintly. She couldn't see them. Didn't need to. She knew. The storm wasn't brewing anymore. It was here. The hum of the station dipped into an uneasy silence as the front doors swung open. The agents walked in, measured steps, black suits crisp, badges gleaming under fluorescent lights. At his desk, Keller froze mid-typing. His pulse pounded in his ears. Fear, relief, or both. He watched as the lead agent, a tall man with graying hair and a stern expression, approached the front desk. He leaned in, speaking low enough that only the desk sergeant could hear. The sergeant, a burly man with a gruff demeanor, straightened. His hand drifted instinctively to the radio on his shoulder. "What's this about?" he asked, wary. The agent's voice was steady, clipped. "Federal investigation. We need access to your records and holding cells. Immediately." The sergeant hesitated, exchanging a glance with a nearby officer. The FBI's sudden arrival was unusual, disruptive, but there was no protocol for outright denial. He exhaled sharply. "Fine," he muttered, jerking his head toward the hallway. "Follow me." From his desk, Keller watched the exchange, his palms slick with sweat. He knew this was because of the email he had sent. He just hadn't expected a response so soon, or so visible. His gaze flicked toward the break room. Carter and Sullivan stood near the door, their laughter gone. Now, only hushed whispers, furrowed brows. Carter's eyes locked onto Keller's. A split second of tension. Keller quickly looked away, focused on his screen, his heart hammering, knowing without a doubt nothing would ever be the same again. The air in the station had changed. Thick, heavy, a tension that pressed against the walls, suffocating in its weight. Agent Daniel Price, the lead investigator, stepped into a dimly lit interrogation room, his team close behind. A second agent rolled in a cart stacked with portable servers and hard drives. They wasted no time. As the tech agents plugged into the station's network, lines of code and file names scrolled across the monitors. Price leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Watching. Anything? He asked. A younger agent with sharp eyes nodded. Plenty. She turned the screen toward him. The case files are riddled with inconsistencies. Repeated arrests. Identical narratives. Gaps in procedure. Her expression darkened. This isn't just bad policing. It's systemic. Price's jaw tightened. Pull everything, he ordered. I want every record, every report, every piece of evidence tied to those two. In her cell, Talia heard it. The faint murmur of voices beyond the hallway. The shift in energy. A ripple moving through the station. Her team was here. She exhaled slowly. The waiting was almost over. She glanced at her wrists. Faint red marks where the cuffs had dug into her skin. She barely noticed them. Her focus was on what came next. The moment when the truth could no longer be buried. In the break room, Carter paced. His coffee sat untouched on the counter. Sullivan leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Watching. Unease creeping in. You think this is about her? Sullivan finally asked, his voice low. Carter stopped, glared at him. Of course it's about her. Why else would the feds be here? Sullivan shifted. You think they know? Carter scoffed, but there was no conviction in his voice. No, there's nothing to know. He said it like he was convincing himself. Sullivan wasn't convinced. Yeah, he muttered. Sure. Agent Price emerged from the interrogation room, flanked by two agents. He carried a folder thick with printed reports, evidence in his hands. As he stepped into the bullpen, his gaze locked onto Carter and Sullivan. They froze mid-conversation. The agents moved in, positioning themselves like sentinels. Officers Brandon Carter and Mark Sullivan. Price's voice sliced through the air. We need to speak with you. Carter forced a smirk, stepping forward. What's this about? His tone was casual, but his stance was rigid. We've got nothing to hide. Price didn't blink. Good. He gestured toward the hallway. Then you won't mind answering a few questions. The room fell silent. Keller watched as the agents led them away. He saw it in their faces, the cracks forming, the tension in Sullivan's shoulders, the way Carter clenched his jaw, his bravado slipping. The once confident duo now looked more like cornered animals. Minutes later, an agent arrived at Talia's cell. The door buzzed open. Miss Porter, he said, his tone respectful. You're free to go. Talia stood. Smooth. Controlled. She met the agent's gaze, nodded slightly, then stepped out. The hallway seemed brighter now. The weight of the station lifting as she walked toward the front desk. As she passed Keller's desk, their eyes met. He opened his mouth, hesitated. She stopped, turned fully to face him. Thank you. Her voice was quiet, but firm. Keller's chest tightened. He gave a small nod, gripping the edge of his desk. He didn't know what came next, but for the first time since joining the force, he felt like he had done something that mattered. Behind closed doors, the interrogation had begun. Raised voices seeped through the walls. At the station's entrance, Talia watched as the agents methodically dismantled Carter and Sullivan's lies. The storm she had waited for was finally here, and it was only the beginning. Inside the cramped interrogation room, Carter and Sullivan sat at a small metal table, postures stiff. Agent Price stood across from them, hands resting on a stack of documents. The silence stretched. Only the low hum of the overhead light filled the space. Finally, Price spoke. Do you want to start with the arrest report? He slid a file onto the table. Or should we jump straight to the planted evidence? Sullivan flinched. His eyes darted toward Carter. We don't know what you're talking about, Carter said firmly, his voice lined with defiance. Price didn't flinch. He pulled a stack of photos from the folder. laid them out, one by one. Still images from the station's security feed. Carter and Sullivan, handling the unmarked bag before Talia's car was searched. Carter's jaw tightened. That doesn't prove anything, he said flatly. We were securing evidence. Price raised an eyebrow. Really? He leaned forward slightly. Because these timestamps say otherwise. He slid over another document. And we have audio recordings, courtesy of Miss Porter's hidden surveillance device. Sullivan's face drained of color. You, he sputtered. You can't use that. That's entrapment. Price smirked. No, he shook his head. It's justice. His voice hardened. And it's just the tip of the iceberg. He let the words sink in. We've pulled records from your past arrests. Dozens of cases, all with eerily similar patterns. He folded his arms. All of them are under review. A beat. But let me make one thing clear. His voice dropped. You're not walking out of here today. Silence. Carter's bravado cracked. His shoulders slumped. Sullivan buried his face in his hands, the weight of their actions finally settling in. In the bullpen, Keller sat at his desk, watching. He had been called in earlier to confirm details about the station's procedures. But he knew the real reason. Carter and Sullivan knew it too. Their eyes had locked onto him the moment he stepped into the room. And for the first time, Keller had seen something in them other than arrogance. Recognition. They knew. Someone on the inside had spoken out, had brought them down. As the agents returned to the bullpen, Keller stood. His hands trembled slightly as he approached Price. Cleared his throat. What happens now? Price studied him for a moment. Now. He exhaled. We clean house. A pause. And you? He looked at Keller carefully. You did the right thing. Keller nodded, a quiet wave of relief washing over him. For the first time since putting on the badge, he felt a sense of purpose. At the station's entrance, Talia watched as Carter and Sullivan were led out in handcuffs. The once smug officers now looked hollow, eyes downcast, their careers destroyed, their power gone. The station buzzed with hushed murmurs. Officers exchanged glances, the reality of the moment sinking in. Agent Price approached Talia, his expression neutral but respectful. We've got everything we need, he said. Your work here is done. Talia nodded. Good. Her voice was steady. Make sure it sticks. Price allowed the faintest of smiles. It will. As Talia stepped outside, the crisp air hit her face. The weight she had carried for weeks began to lift. Justice had been served, and in the days that followed, the fallout would shake the town to its core. Carter and Sullivan's arrests dominated the headlines, their faces plastered across every screen. Police corruption exposed. FBI takes down dirty cops in Arlington, read one bold headline. Footage of the two being led away in handcuffs played on a loop. Expressions grim, stripped of the arrogance they had once worn so openly. The charges against Talia were formally dropped, and every case tied to the officer's misconduct was reopened. The Arlington Police Department underwent a massive overhaul, with several officers resigning under scrutiny. Keller, now viewed as a whistleblower, received mixed reactions from his colleagues. Some praised his courage, others shunned him for betraying the so-called brotherhood. But he held his head high, knowing he had done the right thing. Weeks later, Talia sat on a park bench, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. Autumn leaves rustled around her, their vibrant colors a reminder of change. She had returned to her quiet life, her mission complete, but the experience lingered in her mind. Agent Price joined her, his presence a rare moment of camaraderie. You could have handled this differently, he said, sitting down beside her. Talia smirked, taking a sip of her coffee. And missed the look on their faces? No thanks. Price chuckled. You've got a knack for making things memorable. They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of their work momentarily forgotten. The storm had passed, but the ripples of her actions would continue to spread, ensuring that justice prevailed, at least for now. Within hours of Carter and Sullivan's arrests, the news spread like wildfire. Every major outlet covered the scandal, the fallout growing by the minute. Meanwhile, in a sterile, windowless interrogation room at a federal detention center, Carter and Sullivan sat across from their lawyers. The arrogance that had once defined them had melted into desperation. The charges against them, falsifying reports, planting evidence, abusing their authority, were overwhelming. Sullivan swallowed hard. "This is bad," he muttered. "They've got everything. Audio, video, files. What do we do?" Carter, usually the more confident of the two, clenched his jaw. "We fight it." But there was no conviction in his voice. Their lawyers weren't optimistic. The evidence was insurmountable, and public outrage had already tipped the scales against them. Plea bargains were their only hope of avoiding decades behind bars. Back at the Arlington Police Department, the fallout continued. Internal investigations uncovered more officers involved in similar practices. Resignations poured in as higher-ups scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. The chief of police held a press conference, emphasizing a renewed commitment to transparency and reform, but the damage had already been done. Keller found himself in the center of it all. Some colleagues avoided him, their loyalty to the old guard still intact. Others, more quietly, expressed their support. He didn't care. He had done what was right, and that was enough. A week after her release, Talia met Keller at a small diner on the outskirts of town. The atmosphere was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos they had endured. Keller sat across from her, fidgeting with his coffee cup. "I wasn't sure you'd show up," he admitted. Talia raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You earned this conversation. Not many people would have done what you did." Keller looked down at the table. I couldn't keep looking the other way. But honestly, I don't know if it made a difference. The department's still a mess. And people like Carter and Sullivan, there are more of them out there. It made a difference to the people they hurt," Talia replied firmly. "And it made a difference to you. Don't underestimate that." Her words seemed to ease some of his tension, and for the first time, he allowed himself a small smile. "What about you?" he asked. "What happens now?" Talia leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Now, I move on to the next mission. There's always another fight." Months later, Carter and Sullivan stood in court, their fates sealed. They pled guilty to multiple charges, each receiving a lengthy prison sentence. Their careers were over, their reputations destroyed. The cases they had built on lies were overturned. Innocent people were exonerated. Community leaders rallied for deeper reforms, using the scandal as a catalyst for change. In a quiet moment, Talia sat in her sparsely furnished apartment, packing a small bag. A dossier lay open on the table, details of her next assignment. She glanced at it briefly before closing it, her mind already focused on the road ahead. Her phone buzzed. She picked it up. Agent Price's voice came through the line. "Ready for the next one?" Talia smiled faintly. "Always." As she stepped out into the crisp evening air, the door clicked shut behind her. The fight wasn't over. Not for her. Not for the people she worked to protect. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served, and the truth had prevailed. That, for her, was enough. The truth came to light. Justice was served. But this isn't just a story, it's a reflection of the real world. Corruption thrives when people stay silent. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to ask the hard questions, to take a stand, to break the cycle. So now, we turn it over to you. What would you have done in Keller's shoes? Would you have risked everything to do what's right, or stayed silent to protect yourself? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear from you. If this story gripped you, if it made you think, if it made you feel, hit that like button. It might just push this video in front of someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe in more stories like this, stories that challenge, inspire, and expose the truth, subscribe. Because this is just the beginning. More stories, more hard questions, and more eye-opening moments are coming your way. Your voice matters. Your choices matter. And together, we can make sure the truth is never buried.